Today I'm making a chicken and vegetable pie. I actually thought this was going to be a recipe where I'd practice it and finesse it a few times before finally setting on a version to publish here, but it worked so well the first time that we're going to skip straight to the end. My objective was to make a chicken pie that could be prepared in advance so it could be quickly and simply baked as a main meal after a day out with some friends. It's going to be the type of pie that only has a top crust, but if you prefer a pie with a fully enclosed pastry case, you could of course make it that way, or indeed top it with something other than pastry. More about that later. I'm starting with a 1 kilo pack of chicken thighs. I particularly like to cook with this cut since it's dark meat and it has a lot of flavour, and it takes a lot less effort and precision to keep it moist and tender, compared to, say, white chicken breast meat. I've bought whole chicken thighs with bone in and skin on, so the first thing I have to do is take the skin off and debone them. It's just one bone in the middle there, and it can be a bit fiddly to remove, but if you don't need to keep the meat in one big piece, and I don't, it's probably easiest just to slice it away from the bone in several pieces. I try not to cut right up to the bone, especially at the end, as there can sometimes be some tough connective tissue there. You can buy chicken thighs that are already deboned and skinned if you prefer, but you'll miss out in a couple of ways. Firstly, the skin and bones are not waste products. I will be using them both, although only one in this recipe. But also, you'll pay more for the privilege of having them prepared for you. And that's not just because you're paying for bones and skin in this version. I actually mean that you will pay more per unit weight of deboned meat if you buy it already deboned. At least that's the pricing structure around here. So as a cost comparison, it's almost like they're paying me to dispose of the bones and skin myself. These bones still have quite a bit of meat attached, but that's okay. These can go in a box in the freezer. I'll take them out and make soup with them sometime. Anyway, the skin goes into this big pan where I'm going to fry it to render out some of the fat. While that's happening, I'll also add in some pork sausages. These are Cumberland sausages, so quite peppery and herby. Soft chorizo would also be quite nice, or any sort of sausage you like, really. While that's starting off, I can prepare some of the other ingredients. A bunch of spring onions, which I'll cut in half. The thicker parts will go in nearer the start of cooking. The green leafy bits will go in nearer the end. A carrot, not especially girthy one, peeled and diced, a couple of sticks of celery cut into small pieces, and some mushrooms cleaned and cut into chunks. Now that some fat has rendered out of the chicken skin, I'll take it out and set it aside, and the chicken meat can go in. Whole pieces for the moment, as it's easier to cut into smaller pieces once it's cooked. Little sprinkle of salt at this point. Later on, I will be adding some fresh stock to this pan, which doesn't contain added salt. But if I was going to use a stock cube instead, I would omit this salt here, because most stock cubes are pretty salty. The chicken skin has done its job of providing some fat in the pan, but I'm actually going to continue frying it in a different pan to render out more of the fat and make it completely crispy. Those prepared vegetables can go in at this point too. It doesn't matter much if they're not all in contact with the pan at once, but every now and then I'll just give things a little move around just to make sure that everything gets a turn at being cooked. People are going to say I've crowded the pan here and that you shouldn't do that. And they are right, but they're also wrong. I have crowded the pan, but you can do that. Specifically with this recipe, a lot of liquid is going to come out of the vegetables and the chicken, and that's not a bug, it's a feature. Because everything in this pan will now first be poached in that liquid as it evaporates, and with mushrooms especially, that deepens and increases the flavour. But the liquid, which is essentially like stock in its own right, will boil away and coat the meat and vegetables, and the browning will still happen just the same. Trust the process. If this were chicken breast meat, I wouldn't do this, but for the dark meat, this not only works, but it works really well. The sausages and chicken come out of the pan as and when they're done, and I'll set them aside until they're cool enough to handle. Everything else stays in the pan for now. While that was cooking, I prepared some chopped fresh garlic, rosemary, sage and thyme, maybe about a tablespoon and a half after chopping. You could use dried herbs, but if you do, you might use a bit less, perhaps only a teaspoonful, as dried woody herbs are typically more potent than fresh. Then I'll add about 2 tablespoons of plain flour, which will soak up that fat that's in the pan and create a sort of rough roux. In also goes the chopped herbs and garlic, and I'll let that fry for a little bit, stirring occasionally while I chop up the green parts of the onions. Then once the flour is cooked, half a litre of stock. I'm using chicken stock that I made from bones in my pressure cooker. A stock cube dissolved in the same amount of water would also work, but remember, if you use a salty stock cube, you might not want to add that other salt at the beginning of frying. You could substitute a glass of wine for some of the stock if you wanted. I'm sure that would be nice. I'll bring this to a simmer while stirring. The cooked fat and flour will disperse into the liquid and thicken it into a gravy. Also, in go the chopped onion greens and just a little pinch of dried tarragon, which goes really well with chicken. The gravy, which is probably technically pretty much a sauce velouté, seems thin to start with, so I'll simmer it gently for a while to reduce and thicken it. While that's happening, I chop up the sausages into thick slices and the chicken into convenient-sized chunks. At the back of the pan, everything looks good in there, so the heat goes off and the sausage and chicken pieces can be stirred in. After 10 minutes of cooling, I stir in 200 grams of creme fraiche. This is the half-fat version, about 14% fat. Then transfer all of that to a suitably sized pie dish. I've got this little pie funnel bird here that will sit in the middle and later support the middle of the pastry. Okay, that dish is too small. There needs to be a little bit of headspace at the top or it will boil over when it's baked. I'll have to break out the slightly larger pie dish. Once this is all completely cooled, it can be covered or wrapped and put in the fridge, so this is definitely a pie where most of the work can be done a day or two before the pie is actually needed. And that chicken skin, which I took out and shredded and fried again, we'll reserve that and the rendered fat in a little dish and keep that too. Now it's the next day, so time to prepare the pie. To keep things simple, I'm using ready-made puff pastry. If you want to see me make a pie crust from scratch, I'll link in the description to another video where I did that, but this time ready-made is easier. It's also pretty cheap. The fan oven is preheating to 180 Celsius, and while that's warming up, I'll cut a circle of puff pastry just a bit larger than the pie dish. I like to gently score it in a diamond pattern like this with just the weight of the knife. Then tiny hole in the middle for the blackbird, and transfer it carefully onto the pie dish. A little crimp around the edges to seal it onto the dish, a few little steam vents. Not sure these are strictly necessary, but it will come in handy later on. Then just before the pie goes in the oven, I'll brush the crust with some of that chicken fat I saved from yesterday. Total baking time, something like half an hour, depending on the oven, but I'll keep an eye on it. And about 5 minutes before the end of cooking, I'm just going to sprinkle on some of that crispy chicken skin that I saved. Then back in the oven for the last few minutes. The pastry needs to be crisp and golden all over, and I like to check with a probe thermometer through one of those vent holes just to make sure the filling is properly hot. In a thin metal pie dish like this one, that's seldom a problem, but if you use a heavy ceramic dish, the crust will sometimes finish before the filling. Might be better to lower the temperature and bake for a bit longer in a heavy dish, or if the crust is done first, cover the top with foil, turn the heat down a bit and continue cooking until filling is sufficiently hot. It's best to let this stand for 10 minutes before serving, and it will stay hot inside. And I'm going to serve this with some steamed vegetables from the garden and mashed potatoes. Now there are those who might say a pie needs a bottom crust, and if you want to make it that way, I certainly won't try to stop you. But I find there are many different ways to enjoy pie. Sometimes, like this time, I don't want all that pastry and a top crust is sufficient. But there are other pies you could make with this filling. For example, you could instead top it with mashed potato and make a chicken version of shepherd's pie. Or a savoury cobbler with cheese scones on top, or with a savoury crumble topping made from oats, nuts and cheese. I've made this recipe twice now, and our guests on both occasions were delighted with it, which I think is a far greater endorsement than I could give you on my own. All you need is pie, apparently. Perhaps that's true. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.